Our keynote speaker, our second keynote speaker, is Thomas Kapsidelis. The reason he is here is because I reached out to the mayor of Blacksburg, Virginia. We originally were trying to get a lot of mayors to come to this city to stand in solidarity. The G78 summit that I was talking about. I reached out to the mayor of Pittsburgh, the mayor of Charleston, and then the mayor of Blacksburg, Virginia. She could not make this event. She is at the mayor's conference, but she recommended Thomas Kapsidelis. Thomas is a freelance journalist who's worked in Richmond, in the Richmond Times-Dispatch for 28 years. And what is really was really interesting to me, he sent me his book, and I opened up the first couple of pages of the book, and on that book was a dedication to Gerald Fishman, who he knew personally, and who he knew from his time at University of Maryland. And I thought it was very telling, because there's so many of us will just say it's hopeless. So many of us will say, well, why bother? We can't do anything about the guns. They're just a part of our life. But they weren't the things that Gerald is saying. We can't give up. We have to keep moving forward. He was selected as a one-year residential fellow at the Virginia Humanities to complete work after the Virginia Tech massacre. Kapsidelis is a graduate of the University of Maryland and a Master of Fine Arts Creative Non-Fiction Programming at Goucher College. I want to thank him for making time for us, giving us his perspective, telling us where people are in Virginia Tech this many years later. We all remember that horrible moment for those people. So without any further delay, Thomas, please take the microphone. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Cool.
Thank you, Mayor. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for having me here today. And it's really a privilege to be among you all today, and an honor to make a presentation on this occasion. I want to say a few things about the program today. I've been here since this morning. Great comments and questions from the panelists and audience. It just really, I think up until this point today, through this point today, we've seen all of the key scholarship and political thought and debate points. They've all come up in one way or another, so everyone who's been here has really been exposed to so much of what's important. I was grateful to hear Peter Manceau's talk about his book and his historical research today, and was touched to see how his work really almost comes out and connects with my own. There was a great discussion in this panel that just concluded. I want to thank everyone who shared their thoughts there. And maybe I'd like to point out at the outset, before I go into my remarks, that amongst the Virginia Tech community members, survivors, and many of the families, they too recognize that the problem of gun violence in America is not solely that of mass shootings and tragedies that receive such, and deservedly so, receive so much attention. They too are concerned of violence in our communities, that attacks that do not get as much attention, and the trauma that's suffered there. I want to piggyback just one moment on a comment that Rick Hutzel made this morning during the question and answer session regarding troubled young people who may have, through any number of circumstances in their lives, may come to a point where they are victims of gun violence or participants in gun violence. There's a Virginia Tech survivor, the mother of Emily Hilscher, who was the one of two students who was shot in the dormitory that morning. As you all may recall, two students were fatally shot in the dormitory early in the morning. 2 hours later, the gunman returned to campus and killed 30 students and professors in a classroom building. Beth Hilscher is the mother of Emily Hilscher. Uh, Emily is one of the students in the dormitory. Beth is now a member of the State Board of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services in Richmond, and she's made part of her focus advocating for a transition program that helps young people who in high school may have a individualized educational or counseling program and who are getting really good attention and help in high school, but then that program doesn't follow them to college or follow them to the professional world. And she's looking to establish, to see how something like that can be established. So again, thanks for having me here today. One of the key figures in my book is a Virginia police chaplain who on the evening of April 16th, 2007, hours after the shootings of 32 students and professors at Virginia Tech, was summoned to begin notifying the families of those who'd been murdered. Earlier, Alec Evans had talked with police who were devastated by what they had seen on the second floor of the classroom building at Norris Hall. Together, these two experiences, debriefing the police and then notifying the parents, would come to forever alter Alec's worldview. Over the course of the debate after the mass shootings at Virginia Tech, when gun violence seemed to strike in every setting that we may consider safe, Alec Evans came to this observation. He said, "Everyone is closer than we realize to the tragedies of gun violence. We could be the victims. We could be related to the perpetrators. It's not far to fall before we have guns and alienation and anger." I thought often about those words. On June 28th, 2018, when one of my college newspaper friends from the University of Maryland, Gerald Fishman, and his 4 colleagues, Wendy, Rebecca, Rob, and John, were killed, I was still working on revisions and edits to my manuscript that summer. My book includes some personal observations on the tragedy here in Annapolis. In December, my editors allowed me to update the epilogue with a mention of Time magazine honoring the Capital Gazette staff in its Person of the Year issue. So I'm personally a part of this broad network of University of Maryland and newspaper friends who grieve so personally. And though it's been many years, since our days together in College Park, I have an indelible memory of Gerald arriving on his first day to work at the college newspaper. And he was a dear person, and all of his colleagues there, as John observed also about Wendy, made such a beautiful impression and impact on this community. In the past month, I've been twice to Virginia Beach, where 12 people were killed in the municipal building by a colleague on May 31st. The first time was to attend the city memorial service, and on Wednesday, day before yesterday, I was there to speak to a meeting of the League of Women Voters of Southampton Roads, which is highly energized about the coming special session of the Virginia General Assembly to consider gun safety legislation. I closed my talk there not from reading from my book, but by reading the final sentences of an editorial that was in the Capitol here in Annapolis on June 2nd. The newspaper wrote, "To the community of Virginia Beach, we share your pain. You are not alone. To the families of those who died, our tears are for you. To police and other first responders who put their own lives at risk to save others, thank you again. To the journalists who must cover the endless tide of death by 2s, 4s, 8s, 16s, 32s, and on, search for solutions within your community. Ask how we can make Virginia Beach the last mass shooting in America. Our hearts break for all of you. We know what comes next." As it happens, the headline of the first story that anyone had written about my book was, "What Came Next?" Originally, I thought my book would focus solely on the gun divide in Virginia and the nation. But as I met more survivors and community members and endeavored to follow them over the years, my book did become a study of what comes next for survivors and others who go on to roles in advocacy. In my book, you'll meet Christina Anderson and Colin Goddard, who rode to school together that morning and were seriously wounded in their French class. Christina began a safety foundation as an undergraduate, focusing on safety overall, safer communities, and now additionally helps survivors who want to connect with others who have had similar experiences. Colin Goddard became a gun safety advocate, first for the Brady campaign and later for Everytown for Gun Safety. Shortly after he was shot, he went to gun shows to see how easy it was to obtain a gun from an unlicensed dealer without a background check, and even purchased the gun that was used to shoot him. Another Tech graduate, John Woods, was scheduled to begin graduate studies at the University of Texas just weeks after receiving his diploma in Blacksburg. His girlfriend, Maxine Turner, was murdered in the German class. In Austin, Texas, John found himself literally in the shadow of the University of Texas Tower, where a sniper opened fire in 1966, and to where many of us placed the beginning of this awful history of contemporary mass shootings. John became involved in the opposition to the carrying of concealed weapons on campus. And though that became law in 2016, it was forestalled through John's efforts and the gun safety group that he headed. In doing so, John worked with some of the survivors of the 1966 shootings in Texas, forging a bond across generations. One of those survivors told me that he had attended a memorial service for the Virginia Tech victims at the Tower in April 2007. He said he contemplated during that service how appropriate it was for the Texas survivors to honor the Tech community, but he also wondered why more had not done to properly memorialize and mourn the victims of 1966 and the survivors. There was only a very small plaque in the ground there in Texas. At Virginia Tech, there's a beautiful April 16th memorial, and every time that I've been there, I have never failed to see people come by, pausing from their day at work. They're carrying books, they're carrying their book bags, and they stop to pay respects there. That establishment of that memorial was on the minds of some of the Texas survivors. And in 2016, I attended the dedication there on the 50th anniversary of the shootings of a larger memorial with the names of the victims from that day. Of course, you can imagine in 1966, the conditions were so different than they are now, and how we communicate and how we mourn and grieve publicly. And I feel that it was an education to me and really informed my work to see how people who had lived with this trauma and really in many of their cases lack of recognition endured for close to 50 years, half a century. And the fact that this was a year before the 10th anniversary of the shootings at Virginia Tech was very meaningful. I've told you earlier about Alec Evans. Alec Evans and another police chaplain, Tommy McDearis, along with one of the police lieutenants who was on duty April 16th, they formed a program in Virginia that helps officers who've been traumatized by responding to awful crime scenes, and not just crimes, but the variety of traumatic circumstances that officers have to report to: traffic crashes, deaths of young children, forming families and survivors. They have pioneered a program in Virginia that has become so successful, it's also attracted officers from many other states. Not every state has this type of program. It's called the Virginia Law Enforcement Assistance Program. And they even helped first responders from Sandy Hook, police who responded there. I was an editor at the Richmond Times-Dispatch on April 16, 2007, and was assigned to Blacksburg to supervise the coverage of the shootings. I arrived on campus at about 4 p.m. the day of the tragedy, and I worked there over the next 3 days. When I returned to Richmond, I sensed such an outpouring of emotion and concern. Even the light looked different, and I thought, perhaps naively, this could translate into some definitive action on gun safety and making our communities safer. But when I began working on my book about 3 years later, I found the paths to reforms were much more difficult. But I think that over the decade, sadly, in the aftermath of other mass shootings, it is the work of survivors who have become advocates have opened doors to reform. We've certainly seen this in the past year with the energy that's been brought by the students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida, and the Virginia Tech community acknowledges that as well. So I think a door has been opened, perhaps not wide enough, but I think there's renewed hope. But beyond the legislative front, and this is something I tried to express in my book, the personal healing journeys are complex, last a lifetime, and have to be uppermost in our own minds as we contemplate, as a society or individually, what we want to do about the problem of gun violence. My purpose in writing this book was to slow down the pace for readers who are concerned about this topic but find themselves buffeted by so many tragedies, which are reported so intensely for a short period and then dropped until seemingly the next awful attack. And I think that even among our well-intentioned public officials, it's not adequately articulated how healing and recovery don't unfold in a straight line, but they go on and on. My hope is that all these readers might focus a little longer to contemplate the longer term, what happens beyond the anniversaries that are reported in the news, and in doing so, reconnect themselves to people about whom they care a great deal. Because that's another discovery that I made in working on this book. There are many people who do care deeply about the lives that go on after the tragedies of gun violence, all types of gun violence, but they don't see those concerns reflected in the public discourse. So, given the repeated mass shootings between 2007 and this past January, when I turned in the final proofed copy of my book, one of the issues I learned most about is re-traumatization. While each shooting results in new victims, untold thousands more are re-traumatized and re-victimized. They identify with the tragedies that others have suffered. Well, it's impossible to place a definitive number on that, but the Washington Post reported one statistic that I think is worth thinking about. In March of 2018, the newspaper reported that more than 187,000 elementary and secondary students have experienced a shooting on campus during school hours in the 20 years since Columbine. The Post called this the collateral damage of this uniquely American crisis. And when you think about all the gun violence in our nation, that figure is very conservative, not taking into account the range of other locations where shootings have taken place. And I think it's important to note here that this crisis, this national emergency that we face, is not just about mass shootings, but the homicides in our communities, again, we hear so much less about, and the increased number of gun suicides that have been reported recently. I gave a talk in Washington with Colin Goddard on April 28th in Washington. It was the day after the synagogue shootings in San Diego. Just 2 days later, a gunman opened fire at UNC Charlotte. On May 8th, as I prepared for a talk in Roanoke, the news broke about the shootings at the Colorado STEM school. I watched a CNN interview with Representative Lucy McBath, who became a gun safety advocate after the murder of her 17-year-old son. Her work had been insulted by the new president of the NRA. You all may have remembered some of that controversy. During the interview, the CNN anchor played an excerpt from a town hall meeting that Beto O'Rourke held with young people. And an 8th grader told O'Rourke that her government had done nothing to stop school shootings. And then, in tears, she said, "I'm afraid I'll go to school one day and never come out." In Washington that same week, the Washington Post reported on 2 young brothers, ages 13 and 12, who were shot and wounded in separate incidents, 11 weeks apart, in gunfire outside their apartment, where they play. They weren't anywhere where they shouldn't have been. One child could be paralyzed. In Richmond, a 9-year-old girl was shot during a Memorial Day cookout at a city park. So I very much am grateful for the comments that were made today about the children in our society and what type of environment children are growing up. The tech students I spoke with for my book were impressed by the energy, as I said, brought to the debate by the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School students. They saw themselves again, though this time with more powerful social media and organizing tools that were just in their infancy at the time of the tech shootings. Now in their 30s, they reflected on when they were about the same age as the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School students. One of the students that I wrote about, John Woods, who I mentioned earlier, he reflected on this in my book. John Woods talked about what he had learned from seeing a play at Houston's Yates High School. It was called Gun Violence, the New Normal. It was written by students concerned about what was going on in their community. The theater teacher at the high school said 10 of her students had died from gun violence over an 8-year period. Woods said that he and other Texas gun sense advocates were moved by the presentation, which also addressed domestic violence, how people get weapons, and what guns have come to symbolize. He thought the performed message could move even the staunchest pro-gun rights supporter. If these kids had gone and done this play at the legislature, he said, this is so moving. I can't imagine them just being totally dismissed out of hand. Woods thinks about these students who have grown up with the consequences of gun violence and his own experiences, and contemplates how they connect and how others in similar circumstances can work together. He's aware of how the passage of time can play tricks with memories and the processing of feelings. He's now talking about his girlfriend, Maxine. It's going to be 10 years this year, and that's twice as long as I knew Max, he said. Woods recalled his days as an advocate in Austin and said, the upside of talking about it in the legislature all the time is I basically got group therapy with the whole Texas legislature, which is not the best group therapy. During that time as a young graduate student, fresh from Blacksburg, mourning the death of his girlfriend and the others who were murdered, Woods said he forced himself to repeatedly talk through his emotions. By talking so much about what happened, he worries over time whether he may have numbed himself. Occasionally, I do still feel really strong feelings about it, he said, referring to all the murders on April 16th, 2007. But it's really tough for me to predict when it's going to happen. Part of coping with the trauma and the stress was making these memories safe again, and in making them safe, I detached the emotion from them. His softened voice then underscored his experience at the performance by the Houston high school students. I felt it at the play I saw. For Blacksburg residents who made this special place their home, and in some cases for generations, they too carry trauma and memories in this beautiful rural community, that like the beautiful community of Annapolis and Virginia Beach and so many other places, we can't imagine this tearing apart of our communities. Tommy McDearest, a police chaplain there, talked to me in 2015 about speaking with other law enforcement officers about what they had seen at Virginia Tech and the memories that they carried. Comments from a couple of participants at an earlier meeting took everyone back to April 16th, 2007, and the reality of life-changing, lingering, extended traumas suffered by police, first responders, and the community. The events of 2015 and the weeks leading up to the Tech anniversary show the accumulated stresses on police and first responders. A manslaughter defendant had fatally stabbed himself after being taken to a courthouse holding area following conviction. A missing child was found dead in a septic tank. Another youngster died after her father's car collided with a train. On April 15th, the day before the anniversary of the shootings at Virginia Tech, some area police officers got together for a debriefing, and they were worried about the next day. They were nervous, McDearest told me. There's never been a copycat where people went back to the same place. They've always been nervous that would happen here. Beyond his relationship with the law officers, McDearest has seen the range of emotions through the Blacksburg area over the decades since the shootings. When he mentioned the tragedy during a Lenten talk a few years ago, it upset an audience member who let him know afterward. All he got angry about was that I mentioned it. For him, this is in the past. We're putting it in the past, and we're not ever going to talk about it again. Well, you couldn't have a worse way to deal with a crisis than that. McDearest said, it isn't possible to just not process that. But for him, just hearing about it made him angry. For others, McDearest said, quote, when it gets mentioned, they need to talk about it. And what we've noticed over the years, those of us who are the closest involved, when we come together as a group, sooner or later, that will come out and we'll start talking about it. He asked one police lieutenant, why is it that every time we get together, we talk about this? And he said, well, who else do we talk to about it? If you weren't there, you don't understand. And if you were there, you not only understand, but you know it's never going to go away. And that's the tough part. It's never going to go away. It's going to get better, and you're going to deal with it, but it's never going to be completely over. And truthfully, I don't know that we necessarily want it to be. To me, that's an important passage in my book because it showed how the nation's work to remember, the nation's work to act, to make reforms, the nation's work to be concerned about each other is something that all begins at home. Seeing that in Blacksburg, seeing the start of it, and seeing the start of it in Virginia Beach, sadly, and it is with a heavy heart to say that it's beautiful to see the support in Annapolis, and as panelists have mentioned earlier today, so much healing yet to come, and through that healing, it's important for everyone to always remember and to help and be empathetic toward their friends and neighbors, and I know that's going on in a very large way here. So I appreciate very much the chance to talk with you all today and give you just some ideas of people I've met who have shouldered these burdens for a long time, and I'm glad to answer any questions. I've brought copies of my book, courtesy of my publisher, the University of Virginia Press, and as with Peter, please feel free to come up and have one, and wish you all the best, and if there's any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I just want to see if the council or moved forward any kind of legislation or took any steps in terms of gun control or tried to think of something to do on a local level.
Blacksburg Town Council. Well, you know, Virginia has very strict laws about what localities can and cannot do to protect themselves from to regulate weapons in their communities, and that is one of the issues that's going to come up in the special session of the General Assembly on July 9th. They currently don't have that ability to do it to a large extent. It's not only a concern in places where there's been tragedy, but City of Roanoke, for example, is also seeking to do that. So that's going to be one of the measures that's going to be discussed in July, the special session. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if in your research you were able to look at the circumstances of the shooter and his life and growing up and what brought him to that point of creating that mass shooting at Blacksburg.
Yes, and touched on that just slightly earlier. He had severe emotional problems as a youngster, and also had severe emotional problems, some physical problems as a youngster. He was non-communicative. I believe the specific name is selective mutism. He was, as a junior high school student, he wrote a paper expressing admiration for the Columbine High School killers. This led to him going into counseling and having a very good care given through a combination of the Fairfax County Public Schools. I've read some of those documents about his life as a youngster are publicly available in the archive. There was a thought that as he was preparing for college that he was getting better, and it was not known that he'd taken a very bad turn while he was at Virginia Tech. Another factor that is an issue there. His family came to the United States from Korea. They had very difficult language problems, but the mother was given credit for taking her child to a multicultural counseling center in Northern Virginia. So there were good steps taken while he was in high school, but one of the main conclusions was that he, even despite, this is such a general and specific phrase, just by seeming like he was better, was not should not have been a candidate to go to a large university without the network of support that he had at home. Yes.
I didn't go to the tutor class. I think most of us remember where we were when the Virginia Tech shooting happened. I remember I was with coworkers who had graduated, et cetera. And one of the a very common reaction was, how are they going to survive? How is Virginia Tech going to get through this? And I know it's a difficult question, but you would say that it has survived as a
Yes.
university and a community. And could you say in one, two, or three reasons why, perhaps to help us as well?
Virginia Tech is really an amazing place, and I'll tell you one anecdote. When my book came out, a friend of mine emailed me. A friend of mine from church emailed me and said, "I wanted you to know that the week before the shootings, my daughter and I toured campus, and when we came back the next week, the tragedy took place, and the next day the daughter said, I want to go there more than I ever wanted to go before." It's a place that has a broad, large alumni network, and it is a very together place. And I think it's bigger. I think the people, the students who go there, and the professors who teach there, they're bigger than the organization itself. There's a lot of life there, and I think that's part of it. It was reported in the aftermath, but not as much talked about now, but all the students who were injured, and there were more than 17 injured, I believe, all the students who were injured returned to Virginia Tech and graduated. And I've had a parent tell me, a parent who's really one of the ones who is in the forefront of challenging the administration over the issue of, you all may have recalled this, but the university was very late in putting out a warning after the shootings at the dormitory. And this is one of the parents who was very critical of the university's failure to issue a timely warning. And he told me how much he was looking forward to returning to campus, because even though he had this major disagreement with the university, he wanted to see the place where his son spent his time, and he wanted to see the people who were kind to his son. And I might add that even though there was a very difficult relationship between the administration and the parents and the families of some of the parents and some of the families, that there was a lot of praise given to many of the university people who were assigned to be liaisons with the families. So it's a very complex kind of relationship there. But I can tell you, it's an incredible school spirit that takes place there. It's very interesting.
Thank you.
Sure.
You mentioned pending legislation, special session in Virginia. What is your sense of possibilities there? Do I think
Well, I think it's possible for things to change, but I think there's one thing that advocates are worried about is that Republicans hold a very narrow majority in the Senate and in the House. In the House, legislation can be killed in a subcommittee, which is only 6 people, 4 Republicans, 2 Democrats. They're putting pressure on the Speaker of the House, a Republican, to get these bills out, at least to a committee vote, and get them to the floor vote. The governor, who is a Democrat, wants the bills to be voted on. Both houses are up for election in November, so I think it's a really good opportunity for people to see where their representatives, where their delegates and their senators stand. And so it's going to be a tough road for gun safety advocates, but it will be followed up by the elections, so that's sure to add some pressure, I think.
they're trying to change that state law that prohibits local?
Yes, that is one of the things they want to change, right.
So I want to thank you very much for sharing with us some of your words that you wrote. I have a question, kind of
Yes, sir.
A closeout question of sorts in reference to the writing process. because I know as a writer that a lot of that can be cathartic and healing in and of itself. So going into writing your book, and then writing your book, and then the fruition of your efforts, what have you learned? How do you feel about what happened, and kind of some solutions or extrapolate?
Like a number of people have spoken today, I would describe myself as an optimist. And like many people who made comments today, I think that these problems are solvable, and I don't think that gun violence is inexplicable. As Reverend Tillett said, we have too many guns in the country, and the United States is not exclusively the place where someone may have troubles to the extent that it might push them to a place where they might consider a violent act, but we do have very easy access to weapons. That's certainly a deadly situation. That said, I feel that I've heard Senator Tim Kaine say that the will of the people cannot be thwarted forever, and I think that if people speak out, then I think people speak out. That has an impact, certainly. We were talking, just briefly, I don't want to take too much of your time, we were talking real briefly about Virginia's former law of limiting handgun purchases to one handgun a month. It was a signature achievement of Governor Douglas Wilder's administration. It was repealed just before the 5th anniversary of the Virginia Tech shootings. That's also on the table to become law again. But I did an interview in Richmond this week with a public radio reporter, and we talked about that law. And I went back to its origin in 1993, the concerns about violent crime at that time, and also the concern that that law was really favored by the vast majority of Virginians in public opinion polls. And what the communication was at that time was exert your influence as a majority being in favor of that. And that's kind of the situation I think that gun safety advocates find themselves in now, because polls do show that people are in favor of measures like universal background checks. And in Virginia, I think a recent poll showed that 2/3 of people surveyed think only being able to buy one handgun a month is fine. So thank you very much.
Thank you.